leading service today are elders of the congregation. And so we do this a couple of times a year, and my colleagues volunteered me by a vote of 7-1 to preach today. Last week I pinch hit for Craig, our family minister, who was supposed to preach last week and got sick. And Craig was highly disappointed in not getting to deliver his sermon. And so we have agreed to let him come next week and preach. So Billy will be back with us again on the 24th. And I want to make it very clear that I am not vying for Billy's job. Last week we talked about faith. Actually, we talked about the history of faith. And we went back a long time ago and looked at an incident that took place about 4,000 years ago. God, working through Abraham, was addressing the problems of this world, problems of sin, disobedience, and corruption. And he made a statement, or the author of Genesis records a statement. And that statement said what? It said, and Abraham believed God, and God reckoned it to him as righteousness. Abraham believed and trusted in God. He had faith in God. And because of that, God said what? God said, I'm going to give you the gift of a right standing with me. Now, that happened 4,000 years ago. God set the standard. He set the standard for the relationship between God and man. Believe in me, trust me, have faith in me, and I will give you a right standing with me. And I know that that relationship has not changed in the 4,000 years that have passed. There we go. Why do I know? Because after Jesus came to this earth, walked on this earth, after he was crucified and rose from the grave, after he ascended to heaven, the Apostle Paul wrote these words: know that a person is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. Now, what's interesting about this is that none of the faith traditions, the great faith traditions of this world, get it right. You know, you look at the people of Islam, Muslims. How do you get in heaven if you're a Muslim? Well, first of all, you have to believe in the one true God. You have to believe in the Prophet Muhammad. And then you do acts of righteousness. And at the end of your life, you appear before Allah, and Allah weighs the acts of righteousness against the bad things that you've done in life. And if the balance comes out in your favor, He allows you to enter heaven. So they say what? It's about behavior. It's about behavior. What about Judaism? Well, the Jewish people said what? Jesus came along about 2,000 years after Abraham. And the Jewish people said, well, we don't buy this stuff that Jesus is saying. If you, in fact, want access to God, then you have to be a Jew. You have to be born into the right family. And if you're not a Jew and you want access to God, what you got to do is go through these rituals and we'll adopt you into our family. And then you can have access to God and you can go to heaven. And of course, as Christians, what do we say? We say it's about belief, it's about trusting God, it's about faith. But do we really believe that? Because we struggle with it, don't we? You remember a couple of weeks ago when Billy was preaching? He said he and a man went out to pray over a dying woman. And Billy said, I'll never forget what that woman said. Have I done enough? Have I done enough? See, we struggle with this too, don't we? This thing called faith. And that brings me to what I want to talk about this morning. I want to talk about the rules. You know, we have all these rules. Do this, do that, don't do this, don't do that. It's about what? It's about our behavior. And what about all these rules? What about all these rules? Every faith tradition in the world, has a set of rules. Well, I'm going to get this right in a minute. Islam has the 5 pillars of Islam. The Jewish people, have 10 commandments. Christians have Sermon on the Mount. Every religious tradition in the world has rules. And we don't like them, do we? We don't like them because we didn't make them up. You ever think about starting your own religion, making up your own rules? That'd be cool, wouldn't it? But we don't do that. We don't do that, and we're always bumping up against these rules. We're always bumping up against these rules. What about all these rules? What are we supposed to think about these rules? You know, we have them, and what's interesting about it, every religion has a different set of rules. You ever think about that? You know, I won't pick on Islam, I won't pick on Judaism, I'll pick on Christianity. You know, the big division is what? Catholic versus Protestant. I grew up in a Catholic environment. About 90% of the people where I lived were Catholic. And what? They didn't have enough rules. They had way too much fun. Now, over on the Protestant side, the Church of Christ was right up there at the top. We were the king of the rules. When I was a kid, there was the big 4. Don't drink, don't smoke, don't dance, don't mix bathe. Now, those of you that didn't grow up in the Church of Christ may be thinking, whoa, what are you talking about, Jack? Don't do mixed bathing. That's not about taking a shower together. You know, that was about boys and girls swimming together. If you got in a swimming pool with boys and girls, you'd have evil thoughts, and that was terrible, and you couldn't do that. Except if you lived in Florida. If you lived in Florida, it was okay. Now, we laugh about that, about mixed bathing, but I married one of those Catholics. And the first time I ever took Ellen to church with me, the minister said something about mixed bathing. And of course, her head whipped around and looked at me, and her eyes got big. And she must have been thinking, what in the world is he talking about? But we have all these rules. Every group has a different set of rules. You know, the Church of Christ was right up at the top. The Baptists were next. The Presbyterians were next. The Methodists didn't have enough rules either. They had too much fun too. But we're always bumping up against these rules. We don't have our own religion. We don't make up our own rules. And we're always bumping up against those rules. And let's be honest with each other. What? You know, it's the thing we rebel against. It's almost like what? You can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do that. That's what I want to do. And you remember those people we talked about last week that abandoned their faith? We said they usually just kind of drift off because there's a gap between what they were taught and what they were seeing around about them. And the fact of the matter is when we have questions, when we have doubts, that in part, those rules probably had something to do with them drifting off. Because they just seem so onerous. They just seem so onerous. So that brings me to what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about things. What is the relationship between rules and religion? What is that relationship like? Is there a relationship? And what is the connection between the rules and a God that cares about us and loves us? What's all that about? And to help us think about that, I'd like to talk about a couple of models. But first thing we got to realize is that anytime you have rules, there's a relationship. Anytime you find yourself in a sphere where you're subject to a set of rules, there's a relationship. And these models that I'm about to talk about, I think they'll help us think about this relationship and how this all works. Well, as you can tell, I'm having problems. Three models I'd like to consider this morning: the family model, the club model, and the homeowners association model. Now, these are not my models. I borrowed them from somebody else, but I think they'll help us sort this out a bit. Now, how does the family model work? Well, you are born. You were born, and what? You become part of a family. Your parents don't say, here's some rules, if you'll agree to these rules, we'll let you be part of the family. You're born, you're in. You're part of the family, and then what? Your parents start making up rules. Now, those rules are what? They're made up for a good purpose. Now, some of you young people probably think, well, they just make up the rules because they want to punish me. They want to make me do what they want to do. But they what? They serve a good purpose. The rules say what? Well, I want to protect my child. Some of the rules are about safety. Some of the rules are about teaching kids what's right and what's wrong. Some of the rules are to create self-discipline. So when your kids grow up, what? Be able to control their behavior. So there's a lot of good rules, a lot of good reasons why parents make up these rules. But what? There's a relationship is established, you're born into the family, and then the rules follow. Okay, how's the club model work? Well, it's not the same. Club model says what? I agree to a set of rules in order to get in the club. And if I keep the rules, I stay in the club, and if I don't keep the rules, I'm out. So what happens? The rules come first to establish the relationship. The rules come first to establish a relationship. So those two models, the family model and the club model, are quite different, aren't they? One, the relationship is established, rules follow. The other, the rules come first in order to establish the relationship. And then there's the homeowners association model. That's where it gets confusing. Now, if you're not in a homeowners association, this is the way it works. When you buy a house, if there's a homeowners association in the neighborhood where your house is, you agree to keep a set of rules. You might not even know that you've agreed. Because when you buy a house, what? You sign a big stack of papers. And you usually don't read them. There's a giant stack of papers, and you just sign them and going through. But if there's a homeowners association, you have agreed to their rules. So you move in, and everything's going fine. And then you get a little weird. You put some pink flamingos in your front yard. And you get a nasty letter in your mailbox. And that that letter says what? Jack, you're breaking the rules of the homeowners association. We don't allow pink flamingos. So we want you to remove those pink flamingos. And while you're at it, take that above ground swimming pool along with it. Now, they can't actually make you move. They can't actually make you move. What they can do, though, is make you wish you didn't live in that neighborhood. So, it's kind of confusing, isn't it? Now, what we would like to do is we'd like to take these models and transpose those onto a religious system. And it gets kind of confusing when you do that. Are you in? And no matter what you do, you're not going to get kicked out. You might get disciplined, but you don't get kicked out. Do you agree to a set of rules in order to get in? And if you don't keep those rules, you get kicked out? Or are you in the home association model? That I agree to a set of rules and they can't kick me out, but they can guilt me and they can shame me and they'll never be quite happy with me, but they'll tolerate me. Now, when I talk about this, some of you will think theologically and some of you will think emotionally, because there's a huge emotional component to this. See, some of you were taught the family model, but you've always felt like you're in the club model. Some of you were taught the club model, and you've never really felt like you were a member of the family. And some of you are just confused. You're probably in the homeowners association model. Some of you will think emotionally. Now, why is this so important? Why is this so important? Because each and every one of us, every person sitting here today, at some point is going to struggle with these questions. How does my behavior line up with God? What does God expect of me? When am I in and when am I out? Have I done enough? And how in the world am I ever supposed to know? So what we want to do is we want to think about these questions. And in order to sort it all out, I want to go back to one of the oldest set of rules in all of religion, to the Ten Commandments. But before I talk about the Ten Commandments, maybe a little history lesson is in order. Let's go back to what we talked about last week, Abraham. You remember in the 12th chapter of Abraham, God made Abraham some promises. And one of them was what? I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to make you a great nation. And so, Abraham follows what God tells him to do. He goes to the land of Canaan. And he's there for 10 years. And he and his wife, Sarah, don't have a child. And so Sarah comes to him and says, Abraham, I'm too old to have a baby. But my handmaiden Hagar is not. So why don't you and Hagar, whatever, and maybe we can have a child. So Abraham gets with Hagar and what? They have a son called Ishmael. And all of a sudden, what? Sarah turns up pregnant. And she has a son called Isaac. Now, if you look at this in retrospect, the people of Islam believe that what? Ishmael was the son of blessing. But the people of Judaism and Christianity believe that Isaac is the son of blessing. So today, what? The Arab nations are the descendants of Ishmael, and they think they're that great nation that was promised to Abraham. But we don't believe that, do we? We believe Isaac was the son of blessing. And Isaac has a son named Jacob. Jacob has, 12 sons. And one of those sons is named Joseph. His brothers don't like him because he's got a coat of many colors. They dig a pit, they throw him in it. And eventually Joseph winds up in Egypt. So Joseph is in Egypt. In the meantime, what takes place? Well, there's this famine in the land of Canaan. It's a famine in the land of Canaan. And so Joseph sends an email to his brothers down in land of Canaan, and he says, you know, we got plenty of food up here. Y'all come on up here. And so what? Jacob and the other 11 brothers and all of their families move up to Egypt. And they settle in. Well, things go pretty good for a while. They get settled in, and what? They live there for a while, and they begin to multiply. And they multiply, and they multiply, and eventually some of Pharaoh's lieutenants go to him, and they say, Pharaoh, we got a problem here. You know, these Hebrews are multiplying like rabbits. And pretty soon, if we don't do something, we're going to have more Hebrews than we got Egyptians. And so Pharaoh enslaves the Hebrews, the people of Israel. And that goes on for 400 years. 400 years. You think about that. You think about that. You gather together on Saturday, because you're Jewish. You go to Saturday school. And the teacher what? Tells stories about Father Abraham. He says what? You remember 400 years ago what? Father Abraham got this, or actually what? I think it's been, by that time, 500 years ago. Father Abraham was made this great promise, and we're going to become a great nation. And little Levi raises his hand in the back row, and he says what? But we're slaves. And they said, oh, no, forget about that, Levi. You know, the story goes that what? God made this promise to Abraham, and we're going to become a great nation, and little Levi won't give up. He says, yeah, but we're slaves. And we have been for 400 years. How many of those people do you think abandoned their faith? How many of those people looked at reality and what they were taught and said, I just can't believe that? How many of those people you think gave up hope? Well, along comes this guy Moses. And what happens? Moses goes to Pharaoh, and what does he say? Let my people go. And Pharaoh says no. And Moses said, you'll be sorry, Pharaoh. And then nature goes berserk. There's locusts, there's bulls, there's ticks, there's frogs, there's water pollution. Nature goes absolutely berserk, and it wrecks the economy and the country of Egypt. And eventually, Pharaoh says what? Go. Go. Please go. And a few weeks later, the people of Israel find themselves at the foot of Mount Sinai. And Abraham's going to what? Go up into the mountain and get God's law, of which the Ten Commandments are part of. Now, I don't want to actually read the Ten Commandments. I want to read the introduction to the Ten Commandments, because I think it'll help us give us some insight into this notion of religion and rules and God. And it goes like this, from the 20th chapter of Exodus. And God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God. I am the Lord your God. And the people said, you're our Lord? He said, yep. And that must mean we're your people. Yep. When did this happen? How did this happen? We hadn't done anything. Did this just take place magically? And God went on. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. I have done this miraculous thing. Most of you had probably given up hope. I sent this deliverer that no one expected. And he delivered you out of your slavery. I've done this miraculous, spectacular thing, and you haven't done anything for me. And the people said, well, God, we didn't know what to do. What were we supposed to do? We didn't have any rules. Nobody told us what to do. We didn't know whether they're doing the right thing, doing the wrong thing. How are we supposed to know? And God said, what? I know. I know. And I'm about to give you some rules. I'm about to give you some rules that will tell you how to live in the way that I want you to live. And how to live under my authority. But before we get there, let's get something straight. I am your God, and you are my people. I am yours, and you are mine. Let's be sure we understand that. An interesting thing happened back in Israel. Back in Egypt. Towards the end of all those plagues, God, speaking through Moses, said to the people, I've got something I want you to do. I've got something I want you to do. I want you to go out and get a lamb. I want you to slaughter it, and I want you to prepare dinner. And that was okay with the people. They always did that. Then he said, I want you to take the blood of that lamb and I want you to smear it around your door. I want you to smear the blood up above the door and down the doorpost. And the people said, what? Well, God, what good is that going to do? And what did God say? Trust me. Trust me. Take the blood and smear it around the door. But what's that for, God? Why are we doing that? Trust me. And I want you to pack up everything you own, because we're leaving tomorrow. You must be kidding, God. We've been here 400 years. Pack up everything you own. Trust me. And we all know what happened. That night, the angel of death came over Egypt. And the firstborn of every household died, except for those households where the blood was smeared up over the door. And since then, the Jewish people have celebrated Passover for the past 3,500 years, not to remember the Ten Commandments, not to remember the law of God, but to remember that night that God whispered to them, trust me. And in that trust, you'll find your deliverance from slavery. Well, about 3 weeks later, the people find themselves at the foot of Mount Sinai, and God's going to go up into, Moses is going to go up into the mountain and get the Ten Commandments. But before that happens, what God says, let's get something straight. You are my people, I am your God. I am yours, you are mine. Let's don't forget that. And then he gives them the first commandment. You shall have no other God before me. To which the whole nation of Israel collectively said, duh. You must be kidding, huh, God? You know, how could we have any other God before you? Who could top you, God? You have done this miraculous thing. We've been in slavery for 400 years, and you came in and you embarrassed Pharaoh and you wrecked the economy of of Egypt, and you drug us out of slavery, and you gave us hope, and you gave our children hope and our grandchildren hope. How could anybody ever top you, God? What's the point of all of that? Well, the point is what? The Ten Commandments were a confirmation of, not a condition of, Israel's relationship with God. You ever read the Old Testament? Now, you start out in Genesis and Exodus, it's pretty good. I got some great stories. Then you hit Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Whoa, that's kind of tough sledding. But then you get into Joshua and Judges and Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, a history. Back into some pretty good stories. And then you get into the poetry. Now, you might not like poetry, but what? Some of that's pretty good stuff. It's like reading a romance novel. It's kind of racy, some of it. But then you hit the prophets. Then you hit the prophets. Whoa, same thing. Again and again and again and again. God's people misbehave. And what happens? Well, it's almost like God being a good parent. God says what? 1, don't do that. Don't do that. 1, don't do that again. 2, 3, you're in time out. You're in time out. He does it again and again and again. One time he puts them in time out for 70 years. 70 years. The prophets are God's way of illustrating how he's a good parent. The prophets are God's way of telling us, I'm never, ever going to give up on you. Israel's relationship with God is a model for us. If that relationship is a model for us, we know that we can do what? We can disobey, we can drift to the left, we can drift to the right, we can do our own thing, but God's not going to give up on us. He's not going to give up on us. If you take your Christianity seriously, what you understand is that with God, relationship precedes rules. God chooses the family model over the club model. Didn't have to be that way. Could have been conditional. God could have said, what? Okay, here's some rules. If you keep them, you'll be my people. And the people would have said, gee, God, do we have to keep them all? And he said, well, 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10. If you get down to 5 and 5, you're no longer my people. I'm going to get me some more people. But he didn't do that, did he? He didn't do that. See, rules in religion, the rules are what? A confirmation of, not a condition of our relationship with God. Now, what if God played favorites? What if he said, well, I picked those Israelites because I really like them. They're great people. But you Americans, you Canadians, you Europeans, I'm not so sure. Do the best you can. Be good. At the end of time, I'll let you know whether you made it or not. But we know he didn't do that. We know he didn't do that. Why? You go back to that promise he made to Abraham. The 12th chapter of Genesis. He said what? And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. And later the prophet Isaiah said, I will also make you, the Jewish people, a light to the Gentiles, to you and I, that my salvation may reach the ends of the earth. See, it was always bigger than Abraham. It was always bigger than the people of Israel. The promise was made to all of us. And is it surprising that here we are, 4,000 years after God extended that invitation to Abraham? When he said, I'll accept you, Abraham, I'll accept you with all your flaws, with all your problems, if you believe in me, if you trust in me, if you have faith in me. Is it surprising that 4,000 years later, that God wouldn't make the same invitation to you and me through Jesus Christ our Lord? John, the one who knew Jesus the best, the one who was next to the cross as Jesus was dying. And Jesus looked at him and said, take care of my mother. Take care of my mother. In looking back on Jesus' life, John wrote this. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who behaved, no, to all who believed in his name, he gave the right to become members of his club, members of the Homeowners Association. To all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. God bless you.